Steve, I'd like to welcome you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Alex. I appreciate it. I'm excited to talk with you.
So we're recording this as part of the CMS21 virtual sessions, and it'll be really recorded as one of the Cultured Meat and Future Food episodes as well. And so, with that being said, I'd like to say, Steve, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, I appreciate you having me on here. My background is a mix of traditional and non-traditional to enter into the alt protein space. So on just the professional side of things, I really have a traditional finance and strategy consulting background. I my first major role out of undergrad, I worked for a large institutional limited partner, and they had a $8 billion plus portfolio in private equity and venture capital. So I learned a ton about the private equity space and the venture capital space while working with them. And then on the personal side, that's where the sustainable food and all protein interests started to come into play. Where, like the stereotypical millennial, I watched a documentary and I was kind of blown away by what our food system was doing to our environment, to human health, to animal welfare. And overnight, I became a vegetarian, and this was years ago. And again, it really started as an environmental sustainability interest for me. But I over time was just learning more, and then I started learning about the impact on animal welfare. And for me, that's what really shifted my focus to a fully plant based diet, and there was no turning back for me there. So kind of going back to what I did in my professional life, I was like, well, I love the private equity and VC space. But I'm also now truly obsessed with this idea of alternative proteins and sustainable food. So I was like, how is there anyone out there that's doing VC or PE in this space? And sure enough, there were a handful of firms or individuals focused on it. And I became close with individuals at Straight Out Capital. So Lisa Feria, she kind of took me under her wing for a little while and taught me a lot about the early stage diligence space. And then later on, I ended up working with New Crop Capital, which is now Unovis Partners, and that's where I got a lot of my, I guess you call it, training on the alt protein space. And I knew that if there was a chance to enter into this space as an early stage investor with a mission driven firm, that's exactly what I would want to do. And luckily, I was able to ultimately do that with Clear Current Capital, where I am now, and I'm a principal with the firm, and that's what I'm focused on.
That's exciting. And so Clear Current Capital invests in plant based and also kind of cell based or cultivated meat technologies. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So we think of it as three main focuses. So plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation, whether that be whole biomass or precision fermentation. But at the heart of it, it's really we're investing in technologies or companies that can remove animals from the food system and do it in a scalable way that maximizes both impact and returns for our investors.
And does the firm also invest in technologies outside of these alternative meats, such as milk or anything like that?
Yeah, so we're open to it at the high level. We really like to focus on what we call a center of plate, so like the real meats or things like of that nature. But again, we're really just looking to fill white spaces in alt protein that will allow the space as a whole to flourish, to scale, and get to a level that could be commercially viable and a real competitor to the traditional industrial animal agriculture space.
It sounds like it's very mission aligned with all the great stuff, all the great work that GFI is doing. And I really like the term center of plate. I haven't heard that before, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Is there any direct connections between GFI and Clear Current other than just kind of? I'm sure that your team works together just like GFI works with really everyone in the space.
Yeah, so we have a super strong relationship with GFI, and actually going back to the origins of Clear Current. So Kurt Albright, the founder of Clear Current, he had or has a very strong relationship with Bruce Friedrich of GFI. And back in 2016, 2017, they were noticing that there really weren't many options for institutional investors to put capital to work in this space. There were a few firms that existed, but some of them didn't allow outside LPs, limited partners, or outside investors into their firms. So Kurt, given his background in the investment banking space and the financial services space, he saw this as an opportunity to say, "Hey, I'll start a true venture capital firm that focuses on alt proteins and allow outside capital to be put to work in this space and push the space forward." And again, that was driven by Kurt's relationship with Bruce. Bruce is an advisor to Clear Current, and we work with the GFI team quite heavily, whether that be just discussing opportunities in the space, talking about white spaces, or discussing potential companies or just areas of interest. But we see GFI as just a strong partner for us, and absolutely love everything that they're doing over there.
I want to track back and ask you, what was that documentary that you watched? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was Cowspiracy. So nothing crazy, nothing that wasn't like nothing mind blowing. But for me at the time, it was mind blowing. I really, I was always into health and wellness on the personal side, but nothing to the extent that I was diving into our food system and seeing the impact on the world. So it was really just eye opening, and it led to me going down a rabbit hole of learning more.
I think I remember after I watched Cowspiracy, I was like in the supermarket and I was thinking like everything around me is like not true anymore, right? Like I just
I
felt,
agree.
when you transition to vegetarian and eventually plant-based, I like the term plant-based more than vegan sometimes because there are some people that like to have a little bit of honey or some of this or that, and talking about bivalves is a is a whole different conversation. But did you try to convince your family and those around you to also go plant-based? How did that work?
So I've never been very keen on the idea of being pushy around like individual beliefs. So whether that be politics, religion, diets, or whatever, I feel like people make decisions on their own, and if someone doesn't want to do something, then forcing them really is just not going to be a good outcome. So I wasn't really pushy with my family at all, but I was trying to be or provide some source of education, and I still do that. And some of them have now cut out certain things, or they're more open to trying alternatives. I don't see major progress on that side, but there's definitely a bigger openness. But the one thing I would say is that it was a bit easier for me because at the time my then girlfriend and now wife, she what did the exact same thing with me. So we watched that documentary together, went vegetarian overnight. So while my broader family is still working towards it, hopefully, my main source of support was right there alongside me. So it made it a lot easier.
That's great. It's good to have a partner going into that. So
Exactly. Yeah.
So I want to talk about two different things, and really, first is about kind of startups getting into the space and how they can manage all of the great opportunities there are for fundraising in the space, and it does seem like a pretty hot market. And then the second thing I want to tackle is really about those companies, perhaps even food ingredient incumbents or science and technology incumbents in the space. um, how can they really look out for what is next and what is emerging? And so let's start with kind of the startup question. And so if there is a startup or even an entrepreneur in the space, perhaps a researcher that finds a unique or innovative way to get into alt protein, what is really the best path for them to start talking to anyone that can give them capital, and really kind of in the basic essence of things, where do they start when they should be fundraising?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great question. And I mean at the end of the day, I would say that a lot of the fundraising approach for anyone in alt proteins should be similar to the fundraising approach in any industry, really, if you're focused on bringing in angels or venture capital dollars, where I would say that at the beginning, it's going to be a traditional friends and family idea. So If to your point, if there's a researcher who found a breakthrough approach to creating an alt protein product, I'm sure there's going to be people that are interested at the super super early stages, whether it be friends or family, or even potentially some accelerator programs where they're willing to take a bet on really an idea and maybe a proof of concept at the very earliest stages, but it's really not a business yet. So um, getting that early stage money from angels or even entering into an accelerator program could allow you to say, I have an idea, how do I make this a business? And I think once that entrepreneur feels strongly that they know what business they want to create, obviously there's going to be twists and turns along the way that they'll have to pivot or make changes, but once they know where they think they want to take the business, and how they want to approach it, if it's B2B, B2C, if it's in retail, food service, etc., then I think that allows them to really open themselves up to more institutional capital, like a venture capital firm, where they could say, this is what we've accomplished to date. This is where we need to go. This is over the next 18 months. This is the amount of money that we need to operate. And this is how we're going to use the funds. We're going to use them for hiring key team members because we only have one or two people right now. And we know to really get to the next step and hit milestones, we need to hit on these areas, and we need talent for that, and we need capital for capex and R&D and things like that. So I'd say before you're really sure what the business is going to look like or what you want it to look like, it's going to be just friends, family, angels, and then after that, you could shift over to the more institutional venture capital firms.
And for Clear Current Capital, what stage does the team invest in, and what are some of the average check sizes?
Yeah, so we consider ourselves early stage investors. Our sweet spot is really the seed stage. So for us, that means, I mean, it depends on whether it's plant based, cultivated, or fermentation. But if it's in the plant based space, maybe you have some traction at that point. You have maybe a couple 100,000, if not a little more, in revenue, and you can show that you're getting access to distribution, whether it be in retail or food service, and maybe you only have a co-founder or maybe a couple team members. And then for cultivated and precision fermentation or fermentation companies, obviously it's much less likely that you're going to have any revenue at that point, but you've really proven out that you have a true business model. And for us, we'll write checks as low as call it 250,000 for an initial investment, and then as high as maybe a million or more for an initial investment. And then we plan to follow on in the companies that we feel strongly about in the future rounds. So seed stage is our sweet spot. We'll go a little earlier, we'll go a little later for initial investment, but that's kind of where we play.
I want to ask you a little bit of a tricky question. And in within the industry, we see some firms they almost require that either their team members or those that they invest in are plant based. How do you feel about that? And would Clear Current invest in a founder that's not plant based?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think the answer has evolved over time. So going back however many years ago when Clear Current was started, and when all protein was still even more nascent than it is now, I think it was pretty easy to just say we're not going to invest in anyone unless they're also mission driven, and plant based, because there were so few companies out there, and that those founders were the most passionate ones and they were the ones that were focused on the space early on. Now what's happening and what we love seeing is that people are recognizing the business opportunity. So we are mission driven, we're always going to be mission driven, and that's what at the core of everything we do. But it's okay if people are not mission driven but they're in it because they see the massive opportunity. So for us, as long as they're creating a business that is 100% focused on removing animals from the food system, then that's okay if they're not mission driven, but their company hits on our mission perfectly. If it doesn't hit on it perfectly, if they use some animal products in parts of the supply chain, or if there's an openness to that, then that would be a non-starter for us. So there, we would never invest in a company that can kind of transition to an animal based company. But I would say that it's not now a non-starter if they're not a mission-driven founder, because that just means that the space is becoming more robust, and that's great to see.
There's a lot of within the alt protein world. There's a lot of discussion about um, the idea of plant based, fermentation based, and cultivated meat. But one discussion that oftentimes gets left out is kind of insect proteins. And I know for clear current, that's probably not in the mission because it's animal based. But do you think that from a sustainability standpoint, there could be opportunities to explore insect based proteins?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the high level, I would say yes from a sustainability standpoint. But to be fully honest, you already hit on it. It would just be an area that we don't focus on at all. So I haven't really dug into it just because it's outside of what we focus on. Because again, if there's an animal, insect included in that, then we really stay away. So I would assume there are definitely sustainability possibilities there, but I don't know much beyond that.
Yeah, I think when people ask me about that, I usually give them uh, the impossible foods answer, which is if we can do it with just plants, why wouldn't we? So
Exactly. I mean, we're really shooting for best case scenario here, and it might be a harder thing to hit on where there's just no animals or insects involved, but we think that there's no reason not to be pushing for that.
great. So as we transition, I want to ask you about um, companies that are in the space that are either on the food technology and food ingredient side, or even for some of those more research based companies that are creating technologies in the lab, whether it's fermentation or cell based and cultivated. Um, what is really the best way for these, I guess, incumbents in the space to get in touch with some of these emerging startups? Is it some of the GFI directories? Is it really kind of doing their own research? What is the best way for these supporting companies to get involved? And I want to kind of give an example that um, Clara Foods, which I believe rebranded
I saw that this
today,
morning. Yeah.
right? So a company like theirs has pretty strong partnerships in the food technology and ingredient space. What is the best way for those companies to kind of get more involved in some of these alternative protein companies?
It's a great question and something that we have seen happen more frequently, where the larger incumbents or strategics in the space are starting to either create partnerships with startups or even potentially look at investing in them early stage, which is less frequent, but it is happening. I would say that on that end, it's more about just knowing the alt protein market, because if a large company, like let's take Clara for instance, I know they have a relationship with AB InBev. If AB InBev wants to talk to a startup in the fermentation space, I wouldn't imagine it would be very difficult for them to do so. They just have to contact someone, and the startup would jump on that in a second, which they should, because that could be a really good opportunity, as you've seen with Clara or the Every company now that that's how they're going by. Um, but I mean, beyond that, it's really just like if a large company wants to figure out like what the landscape is like. I think you made a great point. There's resources like the Good Food Institute, who has various databases on either startups in the space, whether that be on the supply side or even on the CPG side of things. And they could just use those databases or even speak to investors in the space like us. That's something that we like to focus on as well at Clear Current. We have relationships on both the early stage entrepreneurial side and that with that community, as well as with some of the large strategics. So it's not uncommon for us to talk to the later stage strategics that want to learn more, and we kind of guide them as best we can.
And you mentioned kind of corporate VCs or CVCs. Have you seen any kind of firms get involved with any of the your deals that might come from the CVC side?
Yeah, I so we to my knowledge, for at least the deals that I've worked on, I haven't seen any end up committing to those rounds. But we definitely know of other, like I know of a bunch of corporate venture capital firms that have invested in this space, and plan to do so. And we love seeing that because they obviously bring a different mindset to the table and different long term potential to the table, where they could be a potential acquirer, they could be a potential strategic resource. So we're seeing that more and more, and I think more the more the better, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I do think they do come in traditionally at later stage rounds, and so maybe as some of these companies are moving on to raise quite a bit of money, we'll start to see more interest in that category.
I agree, and I also think that beyond just that, there's also one thing I've been hearing with the CVCs is that they can be super selective, just like any traditional VC firm, but even more selective to how a company might fit potentially as a partner with their business model. So, for a lot of these CVCs, they're looking for companies that aren't just another CPG brand, but instead there's some true defensibility, whether that be on the manufacturing side or the tech side of things. So they're taking a pretty traditional venture approach, where they're saying there has to be a real moat that this company has created that creates a barrier to entry for other potential competitors in the space. So that's something we're seeing.
So let's actually talk about CPG a little bit. If you are looking at a startup that is developing a new technology, how often do you really want them to execute a CPG uh, brand themselves versus kind of become more of an ingredient? Because it seems that we're starting to see some companies are emerging where they're specifically focusing on execution of CPG. We see other companies that are kind of coming into the woodworks, either supporting the industry. How often do you like them to see and try to execute on a CPG brand?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. For ClearCurrent specifically, our portfolio is almost entirely CPG brands that are gonna be a food product that you could eat with a brand name that you know. Not all of them. Like for instance, we invested in Matrix Meats, which is a cultivated meat scaffolding company, where that's unlikely to be a consumer facing brand, but they lift up the entire industry by making whole cuts and actual opportunity. So for us, we love CPG. We love that space. Again, similar to what I mentioned before, we do look for some defensibility, and it's not just a true brand play. But that is going to exist. Brand is very important, and marketing is very important. But I wouldn't say that we're looking to push entrepreneurs in any one direction. I think that that's more on the entrepreneur to say, what's my background and what's my skill set, or even what company am I trying to build? Like, what do they envision for that company? And if they feel like a CPG route is in the best interest of what they're trying to accomplish as a company, then by all means do it, and we love that. But I would hate to take someone who feels a B2B model is more appropriate, where they're really not a consumer facing company, or even like an ingredient player. For instance, we're seeing a lot of ingredient companies. I wouldn't want to just say, hey, you have a strong ingredient, make a CPG product out of it just because that's what we like. So I think it's more of what does the entrepreneur think is in the best interest for their skill set and what they're trying to build.
As we as we start to wrap up here, but also as we are seeing kind of transitions within the industry, there's been a lot more focus and kind of even marketing towards the aspects of creating fermentation based products. But what kinds of trends do you see within the alternative protein space going on? As we kind of close out 2021, go into 2022. Are there any particular trends or new companies within ultra protein that you see are starting to ramp up?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the hottest space right now is probably the fermentation side of things. I think in alt protein, if someone wants to raise some money, they slap fermentation into their deck, and you see the valuation start to fly up. Obviously, I'm joking a bit, but that's obviously a very hot area, and I like that because for us, one of the theses that we have right now is hitting on the area of whole cuts. So like a steak, a fillet, chicken breast, things like that. because to your point about trends or areas to focus on, so far throughout all protein, throughout its existence, there's been a lot of focus on the minced meat products like burgers or nuggets, and there's so much progress that's happened there, and we love seeing it. But the vast majority of all meat products in the traditional animal ag space is whole cuts. So we're seeing whole biomass fermentation come out and starting to hit on those whole cuts. We're seeing plant-based companies do it, and we're seeing a lot of cultivated meat companies starting to do that as well, either through hybrid products or just traditional cultivated products that have some type of scaffold in there. Um, but I would say so. Maybe it's less on just fermentation, but more on whole cuts. That's something that people are like, this is a major opportunity, and we need to hit on that. So that's probably the biggest area that I'm noticing a lot of traction in right now.
You mentioned nuggets, and we're starting to see a lot of different companies come out with nuggets. Impossible released a nugget. Is there a point where there's just too much, excuse me, too much saturation in a particular kind of direction?
Um, I mean, at some point, there's definitely going to be. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think that it seems like there's a lot of new brands popping up or new companies that are focused on nuggets, but in reality, they're just a drop in the bucket of the total animal based nugget space. So for chicken nuggets specifically, I don't have the number off the top of my head for what that market size looks like. It's in the billions. I know that for sure. So I mean, for companies to be entering into that space is fantastic, and I also keep in mind that they might start off as nugget companies, but along the road they might transition to focusing on whole cuts or different types of products as well. So um, right now, I don't think we're at that saturation point. It will happen at some point, and not every single company is just going to win because the market's big. Like that's just not how business works. Um, but I think right now it's not saturated.
I want to ask you about some of the recent discussions around, um, cell cultured meat, cultivated meat, and really two different aspects. One, there are a lot of companies that have been touting earlier release dates. Some have executed on that. Excuse me, but what are your thoughts on really kind of these cell based or cultivated meat companies pushing really hard to get a release date out versus um, actually progressing? It's actually difficult to say, but to say it in a little bit more of a direct way, there are discussions that there's a lot of pressure from investors to have early release dates, maybe too early. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So at least from what I'm seeing, like again, just truly what I'm seeing and hearing, I haven't seen investors push for earlier release dates, but I would not doubt it that that's actually happening by any means, especially the later stage investors who are coming into these later rounds with multi-million dollar checks. It makes sense. My opinion on that is the release date doesn't matter at this point in the life cycle of cultivated meat or cultured meat. It really is like, let's say the FDA and USDA come to a joint agreement on how that companies can start selling products to consumers. That would be fantastic, and that's something that we've heard is very close to being on the horizon, whether it be by the end of this year or early next year. So super exciting. But once that happens and companies start releasing product and they have that release date and they sell a couple products with some nice photos, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the space is at a commercially scalable level where we're going to be selling thousands or millions of tons of product per year. So for those, if there are investors or individuals pushing for an early release, I don't know if that's just to juice up the excitement for the next round that could be raised at a larger valuation, but I don't think it actually has much of an impact on the space overall. So I'm thinking more long term when I think of this space and the companies in it. So I don't care if they release something in a month or 6 months or a year. It doesn't seem to really impact it too much in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong.
I hope I hope all the companies are listening to that, because you really do have to go at it at your own pace, and like you said, regulation is also something that takes some time. On a similar note, there was a recent article that really discussed the long term feasibility of cell cultured meat. And I mean, we've heard this argument many times, and over the last couple of years, it's been, I guess, reference to like the biofuels industry, which pretty much says there's an efficiency cap, and after a certain point, you can't really produce more in a more efficient way. And so, how what's kind of investor sentiment on not necessarily articles like these because they come out quite a bit, but knowing that because we haven't scaled, there could be an opportunity, or I guess a limitation to the maximum output, for example. What's an investor sentiment there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's those thoughts are there's a lot of validity to them, and I think if investors or even individuals who entrepreneurs in this space or individuals working at cultivated meat companies, if they don't see that as a possibility that scalability is not guaranteed, then that is kind of putting too much of a rosy picture on the space that might not even allow us to innovate in the way that's necessary for the space to flourish. So I think that I would agree with a lot of some of the things I've been reading, but I think the disagreement for me, or not disagreement, but the area that I think isn't taken into account enough is that there's continual innovation, and the long-term state of the industry is not going to be based on what exists currently today. And I've seen a lot of response articles, whether it be from GFI or I even think Vow Foods out of Australia. They came out with a really good response where the idea is that there will be continued innovation in the areas that need it. So whether it's the cost of growth media or the feasibility of scaling up with bioreactors the way they are now, uh, innovation is going to continue. And I'm seeing that as an investor, where I'm talking to a company. I talked to a company the other day that internally they're able to bring the overall cost of their growth media down by 80% compared to industry averages. I haven't vetted that, but that's something that I've heard. I talked to a potential company, or a company that's potentially addressing the bioreactor side of things, where they're not taking a bioreactor approach. They're creating hardware and software that will create the same environments that a bioreactor might have, but in a manner that might be more scalable. And I have no idea if that company is going to be the one that revolutionizes the industry. But I guess my point is that there's constant innovation. And I think to take a view that the space can't succeed based on where we currently are with the technology that's available is a little bit short sighted. So I don't know what's going to happen at the end of the day, but I think that the investment in the space is warranted because we've been proving time and time again in other industries that people can innovate and make things happen that others thought couldn't happen 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and really the thank you for that, and really the Rethink X report kind of comes to mind. Whereas by 2030, we will see some pretty radical shifts, and so we've seen things change very fast already. So I want to give a quick shout out. You mentioned Matrix Meets. Jed Johnson will be presenting on a panel on day one or Friday of CMS21. That path is, or excuse me, that session is titled "The Path to Scaling Cultured Meat Production." There's also a regulatory panel that also happens on Friday, so we'll probably be hearing quite a bit of that as well. Steve, are there any last insights or even discussion topics that you'd like to cover before we wrap up today?
No, I mean, I this is the space I love, so I could talk about it nonstop all day, and just this is where I like to play. So, but nothing in particular. I think that this has been a really good conversation, and I appreciate you allowing me to share my thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll be able to actually do this again sometime because, like we discussed, the industry is changing pretty rapidly.
Absolutely, I agree. Hopefully, we can do it again soon.